This chapter, we will be talking about quadratic equations. A quadratic equation has the form of y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. And the bx plus c is like our linear equation. Now we're going to be adding this part where we have an x squared. The a can be a 1, it just cannot be a 0 because that would make this entire term disappear. These quadratic equations make a graph that is in the shape of a parabola, and we will look at what a parabola looks like. A parabola is a U-shaped graph, as you can see here in the blue. It looks like a U. It could also be an upside down U if the graph flipped over. There are several key factors that we need to look at for these graphs. First of all is the axis of symmetry. The axis of symmetry is this line that goes straight through the center of our graph, and it's called symmetry because if we were to fold the graph along this line, the left and the right sides would match up perfectly. So that spot would match up with that spot. This spot down here would match up with this spot over here. So that's why it's called the axis of symmetry. The next key information point is this spot down here, which is called the vertex. The vertex is either your lowest point on the graph in this example, or if it were flipped around and it opened down, it would be the highest point on your graph. The vertex is where your graph stops going down and starts going back up, so it's that turning point of the graph. Y-intercept is just like that for a line. It's where your graph crosses the y-axis. So here's the y-intercept. And in a few chapters, we will be talking a lot about these x-intercepts. But the x-intercepts is just where the graph crosses the x-axis. Now this slide has a lot of information, and I'm not going to read all of it to you, but you could pause it and read it. Up here, it talks about the vertex, which I talked about on the last slide. The vertex is a minimum if the graph opens up. So down here we have this minimum point. There's my vertex. It makes a minimum. And if the graph opens up, then the range of the graph is y is greater than or equal to whatever this minimum value is. So here it would be -3. So that's where we get our minimum value. If we have a maximum value and our graph opens downward, this vertex is going to be our maximum point, and in this case, the range is going to be less than or equal to whatever that maximum value is. So in this case, it would be 4. So right down here, I have the range is less than or equal to 4, and on this one, the range is greater than or equal to -3, because it starts at -3 and goes up. It starts at 4 and goes down. Now, here's an example for you to try and answer some questions about. This slide contains the steps for graphing a quadratic. When you look at the equation, the a is the number that's always in front of the x squared, the b is the number that's in front of the x, and the c is the number that has no variable with it. Few key things to point out. Whenever you're finding the axis of symmetry, you always need to write x equals, and then you take the opposite of b, divided by 2 times whatever your a is, reduce this fraction, and that gives you the axis of symmetry, but it needs to be x equals this number. Once you have your x value for your axis of symmetry, you're going to plug that x value into both of these places and get your y value, and this x and y value give you your vertex. You should be able to look at the graph if you have the graph made. If not, from the equation, to identify you will have a minimum if this a is positive. So if the a is positive, your graph is going to open up and make a smiley face. If the a is negative, then your graph is going to open down, being like a frowny face, and that's going to give you a maximum. The easiest way to remember that is if your bank account is positive, you're going to be smiling. If your bank account is negative, you're going to be frowning, which then once you have the picture, you can determine whether you have a minimum or a maximum. We can use these values and these key points to sketch a graph. Just like when we had a linear equation, this bx plus c is the linear equation part. This c is my y-intercept. So just like mx plus b, this c value, the number that doesn't have a letter with it, is going to be your y-intercept. All right, we're going to take a few minutes and look at two different examples that I want to help you work through on the assignment or the quiz. This first one gives you an equation of a quadratic, and it's going to ask you to find several different things. Before you start on any of these, first thing that you need to do is identify what your A, B, and C are. So I'm going to write over here A equals, B equals, and C equals. My A is going to equal -1. My B is going to equal -2 from up here. And my C is going to equal 1. So now that I have those identified, I can start by working on my axis of symmetry. Remember that the axis of symmetry has the equation x equals -b over 2a. When I fill in these numbers, I have negative times -2, so that's going to be +2, over 2 times -1. So when I plug that in, I get 2 divided by -2, which is -1. So I am now going to use this number and plug it in to both of these x values on my graph. All right, so I have entered this equation, and whenever I plug in a number, I'm going to put that number in parentheses so that it will take care of squaring if I have to plug in a negative like this example. So I have negative and then parentheses -1 squared minus 2 times -1 plus 1. And when I enter that, it gives me a value of 2. So when I go up here to enter my vertex, I have to enter it with an ordered pair, so -1, 2, and that is the correct answer. The next part is going to ask me for the axis of symmetry. They've already typed out x equals, so all I have to do is type in the -1. But if the x equals had not been there, I would have had to enter that. The next question is going to ask me about it being a maximum or a minimum. And remember, we can tell that from this A. Since my A is negative, that means like my bank account's negative. So I'm going to be frowning. So my graph is going to look something like that. And my vertex is going to be a maximum because it's going to be the top part. The question about the maximum value is, and that's going to be the same as this y value of my vertex. So I'm going to re-enter that 2 here. And then finally it's going to talk about the range. They already have the y, and I have to select which inequality. Since my graph is going down, this point up here is going to be -1, 2. So this point is 2, and I go down from there, so it's going to be less than or equal to 2. All right, we will look at one more example before you're on your own. All right, so here is my equation, and this one's just going to ask me to graph. So I'm going to show you how to use this graphing tool on Math Excel. Like before, I want to identify what my A, B, and C are. So my A is the number in front of the x squared, which is 1. I don't have an x on this example, so that means my B has to be 0, and my C is going to be -4. Again, if we're missing an x, then my b has to be 0. So to find the vertex, because that's the first thing that I'm going to have to do to be able to graph this, to find this vertex, I'm going to start x equals negative b over 2a. Well, negative 0 is just 0 over 2 times 1, which is 2, and that's going to give me 0. So my x value of my vertex is 0. And then I plug the 0 into this equation. 0 squared is 0 minus 4. Or you can use the calculator if you're not sure. But I'm going to get negative 4 here. So that is the vertex, 0, negative 4. So I'm going to go over here and click on the one that looks like the U shape. And I'm going to go to 0, negative 4 and plot my point. Now if I move my graph, you can see that it's going to be several different parabolas that are possible. To figure out where to put the second point, I need to plug another value into this original equation. Right? So I'm going to bring up my calculator, clear that out, and I'm going to just pick, since I have this x value of 0, I'm just going to go over one spot and try and figure out where that is. So I'm going to plug 1 into the equation. So 1 squared minus 4. And I get a value of negative 3. So I'm going to plot 1, negative 3, which is right there. I'm going to save the graph, and then I'm going to check my answer. Okay. Then it asks me to enter the vertex. So that's going to be the 0, negative 4. All right, so I hope this answers all of your questions. If you have more, ask me in class.